Hey everybody, my name is Jonathan. This is my first podcast ever. So totally new to podcasting. I've never done my own, I've never been on one, and I've wanted to do one for quite a while. I just didn't know what to talk about really. So for my first episode ever, I'm going to talk about growing up in foster care. So I'm 30 years old right now, and I was in foster care from the time that I was, I think, grade 3 until grade 10, so from about 8 years old until 16 years old. And during that time, I had several different homes. I had, I think, 7, maybe 8 homes, and some were good, some were bad. To be honest with you, the majority of them were not so great. I wanted to talk about my experience living in foster care and what it's like, some of the challenges, some of the positive things, and yeah, just give you guys a bit of an insight into that world. I was in the Canadian foster care system. So I'll start out by talking about why I was in foster care. So when I was young, my parents divorced. I think I was about three years old when that happened. And when my parents divorced, it was decided that I was no longer going to be allowed to have visitation with my dad until basically I decided that I wanted to, which I didn't do until way later on. So I was living with my mom, and unfortunately my mom suffered from pretty severe depression. So there were various times where we would have a disagreement or an argument, and honestly I wasn't the easiest kid to deal with. I was a bit of a troublemaker just because of maybe the divorce and being upset that I didn't have both parents. I'm not totally sure, but yeah, I wasn't the easiest kid to deal with, and that kind of exacerbated my mom's depression. So there were times where I would phone the police and report her because I thought she was going to take her own life. I remember there was one time where I found a knife between her mattress and her box spring. And I guess her plan was to go to bed and then not to come back out the next morning. So once I figured out that that might happen, every night I would start checking her bed before she went to bed, before I went to bed, for any weapons or kitchen knives that she might use, because I was afraid of waking up and not having a mother in the morning. And again, like, she suffered from depression. Like, this wasn't necessarily bad parenting or anything. It's just she didn't know how to deal with things. And I don't think she would have actually taken her own life. I think she cared about me way too much to do that. But the temptation was there and the struggle was there. So I'm just trying to illustrate why I wasn't able to live with her, basically. But eventually she decided to go and get help. She put herself in a hospital so that she could be a better mother. And at that time, I went to my first foster home. And the first foster home was actually a family friend. So I stayed there for the summer. I thought it was just going to be a short-term thing. I was there for the summer until my mom got out of the hospital, and then I'd go back and live with my mom. And this foster home was great. The kids there, they had boats that they would use to like go to sailing lessons and stuff, or just to like cruise the lake. So they rented me a boat for the season, and I actually got to go boating all the time. And they actually signed me up for sailing lessons, wakeboard lessons, and I even had my own job. And by the way, I was 12 at this time, so this was just entering grade 3, 11 or 12. I'm not sure how old you are in grade 3, but I was in grade 3 at this time, and I was making $20 an hour doing landscaping on various islands, which I didn't realize at the time was really good money, but now I realize that was pretty amazing for the time period. I say time period, it makes me sound like I'm like 300 years old. But yeah, it was only like 20 years ago, I guess, or not even 20 years ago. Yeah, I would use the money, I would use the money for just boxes of candy. There was a marina across the waterway from where the house or cottage was that I lived at. And I would just go there every Friday, and I would buy like these massive boxes of candy, because at the time there were 1 cent, 5 cent, and 25-cent candies. And I think that the 25 cents were like the sour keys, which was my favorite. So I would go and buy this massive box of sour keys, and then I would just eat them until my tongue started to bleed, essentially. It sounds disgusting now, but at the time, that was like my limit to stop eating sour keys, is when my tongue started to bleed and it hurt too much. And even then I would probably eat like 2 or 3 more because the flavor was so good or something. I really don't know. I don't understand it now. So I was at this foster home until the end of the summer, and then after that, I ended up going to live with another friend who was in my grade 4 class. And this was one of my really good friends, so I had spent time with his family, and his family decided that they were willing to take me in. And at the time I thought, this was pretty great, like I like hanging out with my friend, but one thing you don't realize is your friends are really cool and it's fun to hang out with them, but it's not as fun to live with them. You get to learn like different little idiosyncrasies that they have, and there's always points of frustration when you're living with a friend. And we had to share a room, which I don't think he was super happy about, losing his room that he previously was the only person inside of. So it had its challenges for sure, and in hindsight there were definitely some things that were questionable that I didn't maybe realize at the time. For one example, we used to play red butt outside of his house, and his dad would just like whip tennis balls at us, which like seems cool as kids, like it's fun to play red butt, but when you have like a full-grown adult throwing tennis balls at you, it might just be like borderline child abuse. So that wasn't as great. And then from there, it was determined that I couldn't stay there forever, so I actually ended up being entered into the actual foster care system. And that's when I went to my first home. That one was probably my worst home. There was another kid that lived there, and that kid was pretty abusive towards the foster children that were in the home, and even the other foster children were a little abusive. So there was like some sexual abuse, there was some physical abuse, that sort of stuff. So I actually ended up getting out of there eventually. I made a lot of complaints to my worker, and she was able to move me. But I found out years later, I think like 2 years ago actually, I found out that that foster home is still in operation, which just like mesmerizes me that that's still a thing. There's such a need for foster parents that actually care about the kids. There's so many people, from my experience, and obviously I'm making a generalization because of my lived experience, but there's so many foster homes where they just want the extra income that you get for having a kid, so they'll take as many kids as they can, and then honestly they just treat them like shit. And some are better than others, obviously, but the system could definitely use some improvement. So that's a bit of a digression there, sorry about that. But yeah, I was there, and then I got moved into another home, which was a lot better. The people coming in and out of foster care are very interesting. So I had multiple roommates. Some people would stay for like a couple months, some people would stay for a couple of years. There was one kid at this foster home that I lived with at previous foster homes. So it's very interesting. Like, we all just get cycled around. That affects you in a lot of different ways. Like, I think I switched schools probably 6 times, and some of them were the same school, which was fortunate. It's so hard going into a new school and making new friends, especially when you're coming from this foster home, which is usually a home that's like not in the greatest neighborhood, and the kids on the bus, they usually know that. So there's already like a preconceived notion about who you are, that you're like a delinquent because you're in a foster home. So it's really hard to like make new friends and fit in, A, when you're moving halfway through the school year, and B, when you're coming from like this impoverished neighborhood and people think that you're this deviant because you came from a foster home. Just on that note, I want to say, like, a lot of the kids were fairly deviant in the foster homes, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily their fault. Like, a lot of them come from broken families, much like myself. There's a lot of nature versus nurture there, where like you're pretty much set up for failure. So I don't fully blame the foster care system. I don't think we should write kids off because they grew up in foster care. I think that they have a pretty bad setup from their own parents, and then even in the foster care system, they have a pretty bad setup, because oftentimes they have to go through a lot of homes, first of all, and second of all, a lot of the parents in those homes really don't care about the kids. which is really unfortunate. So when we see those kids, or if we're in school and we see those kids, we see the byproduct of what's happened, but we're not seeing what has actually taken place and what they've endured and been through. So just something to note there. Again, that was a bit of a digression. Yeah, we had different kids coming in. Like, I know there was one kid that dealt drugs and that's why he was in the foster home, and then another one was just pretty abusive. And I got into a lot of fights in foster care. Fortunately, before I went into foster care, I did judo starting when I was 6. So I wasn't aggressive and I didn't start any fights, but I was fairly comfortable in that environment if somebody started a fight with me. And fortunately at that time, like, MMA wasn't popular or anything, so no one really knew how to fight. So I just like flipped them or tripped them, and that seemed to be the end of that. Pretty simple. But yeah, it's still an interesting environment, because I don't know what it's like to grow up in a normal home per se. Going into a new foster home in particular, the first few nights, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know whether someone's going to come into your room. You don't know if you have a roommate, whether they're going to attack you in your sleep, whether they're going to try and undress you while you're sleeping. There's a lot of things that perhaps people don't think about if they have never grown up in a foster home or a not so great environment. So it's very traumatic, and it kind of just puts you on a really high level of alertness all of the time. I've listened to different talks and read different studies, and that obviously has a physiological effect on you as well, and on your health. So it's not just mental, but it's also physiological. I don't know any stats for like how long kids that grew up in foster care or kids that grew up in an abusive home live in comparison to people who didn't. But if you know, like, feel free to drop that in the comments. I'd love to learn more about that. Or if you have links or anything that you can share, that would be awesome. But yeah, I was in this home for quite a while, like a few years, and then I ended up getting switched out. I'm not exactly sure why. Like, there's a lot of stuff that happens in foster care and you're not exactly sure what's going on. So I got switched to another one, and then that one required me to switch schools again. Fortunately, it was at a school where there were sports, and I ended up joining one of the teams, the basketball team, and that got me in with the popular kids, thankfully. But then my foster parents decided I was too quiet, so they shipped me off to a group home in another town, and that's when I started high school, and I had to start in a completely new city. Didn't really know anybody except from when I was in foster care in like grade 3. So I knew people from when I was 12, I guess, but then I hadn't seen them until I was 15. So I wasn't necessarily popular, and they didn't really remember me other than like my name, and I was that kid that moved away in foster care. So that was really hard. I ended up skipping a lot in grade 9. I just didn't want to be there. I was so fed up with switching schools. And at this time, they actually moved me to a group home. So the environment there was brutal. Like, my roommate in the group home, he shot someone with a bow and arrow. They didn't die, but he was trying to kill them, or so he told me. And then the other kids there were drug dealers, like weed dealers, basically. So not a huge deal, but yeah, they were drug dealers. So it was a pretty scary environment in comparison to like the regular foster homes I had been in. I tried to escape there as much as possible. I was super embarrassed to leave because the group home was right along the bus route. So if you got on the bus at the group home, everyone would know that you lived in that group home. So every time I took the bus, I would walk down the rest of the street, and there was like this nicer neighborhood down the street, and I would just hang out there in the morning and get picked up from there. The group home kids would make fun of me for doing that, but I just didn't want people to know, and I feel like people probably figured it out anyway, but it was just a defense mechanism that I used. It made me less embarrassed, and oftentimes I would get off the bus and then not even go into the school. I would just go into the forest and go hiking for like 8 hours, and then I'd go back home. And because a lot of the other kids in the group home didn't go to class either, for various reasons, whoever got to the group home first, usually, as long as it was somebody that was liked by somebody else, we would delete the voicemail from the high school that said like, your child has skipped class, or whatever that automated voice message is. So the deal was whoever got to that first would just delete that, and then the people operating the group home wouldn't know, hopefully. Hopefully they wouldn't be home before we got home, so that would work out. In the group home too, like that was a really instrumental part of my life. There was a church down the road that one of the other kids from the group home would go to. He would attend youth group, so he actually ended up bringing me there. I got along really well with the pastor's family. I'd gone to church, but I had never really liked church. I guess I identified as being a Christian, but looking back, I definitely wasn't. I would pray periodically when I was having a really hard time, and that was definitely helpful for me going through foster care, but I hadn't really started becoming a Christian until I started going to this church, basically. I'd gone to church before with my mom, like a long time ago, but my entire time through foster care, I was never taken to church. None of my foster families went to church, so I kind of fell away from church. And while I identified as a Christian still, I didn't really act like a Christian. I didn't really pray at all. I didn't do anything until I started going to this church. And honestly, I just went to the church because I wanted to escape the group home, so I would go to anything they had offered because it was better than what I would have to do at the group home. So I started going there a lot, and then after just under a year, I think, I ended up getting baptized and definitely got more involved in Christianity. I wouldn't say that I was a perfect Christian by any means. Like, I did a lot of stuff that is not very Christian after I got baptized, and it took me quite a while to kind of recover from the trauma that I experienced in foster care. I did a ton of counseling, and I made a lot of mistakes. Honestly, like, a lot of my growth was just by making some pretty brutal mistakes. But going back, I was in the group home for a year, and then I moved back in with my mom when I was 16. And that was also the time that I actually met my dad, or re-met my dad. I hadn't seen him since I was young. I remember I invited him to a few hockey games, but I didn't actually have any interaction with him. So when I was 16, we had what's called a supervised visit. So I went into the Children's Aid Society, and they provided me with a counselor, and then my dad and his new wife met me there. And it was kind of like meeting my dad for the first time. I walked into that room, and it was a male counselor that they gave me. And I remember not knowing which person was my dad and which person was the counselor. So I just went in, and I was really quiet, and I waited for somebody to talk in hopes that they would kind of reveal which person was which was a pretty hard scenario to deal with. As I got to know my dad, our visits progressed a little bit. I ended up seeing him about once a month, and they started out as supervised visits, and then they eventually became unsupervised visits later on. And again, the supervised just means like a social worker comes with us, and then unsupervised is obviously the social worker is no longer there. There's enough trust built up where they think things are going to be okay. And now I have a better relationship with my dad. I see him for lunch, I hang out with him a lot more, and that's gotten progressively better over the years. But it's definitely taken some time, and it's still not perfect. So there are lasting effects from going through all of that stuff. And I won't get into like why I wasn't able to see my dad at this point, but if you guys want to know more about that, I'm happy to talk about that in a different video. Over the last few years, I've gotten a lot closer with my mom as well. I think initially I resented her because I went into foster care, and that was really hard to work through and talk to her about. My mom actually passed away in 2020, which was really difficult because we were at a point where we were talking to each other every day. Like, I would phone her every day, every time I commuted to work, every time I was in the car, and we just got really close. And especially after I had my daughter in 2014, we became a lot closer at that point. My mom was really instrumental in helping me when I had my daughter for visits. Oftentimes they would be at her house. So we really grew closer as a result of that. It was really difficult to work through like this feeling of abandonment because I had to go to foster care because she had to go and get treatment at the hospital. So just having those discussions and talking about that, apologizing to one another for like how we treated each other earlier in our lives. But I'm really grateful that we had a good relationship before she passed away, for at least a few years before she passed away. And we got to spend a ton of time together, which was awesome. One thing I often get asked, having been through the foster care system, growing up in the foster care system, is would I ever want to be a foster parent, like a good foster parent now to kids? And it's a really complicated question for me because in theory, I really like that idea where I could be a good parent to somebody. But on the flip side of that coin, it was a really traumatic experience for me. And going back into that system that I know is so flawed and so frustrating, and having to work with the people at the Children's Aid Society, I just don't know whether I would be able to do that. I think it would definitely re-traumatize me and reintroduce me to a lot of the hurt that I felt in my life. And I think that would be very difficult, and I'm just not sure whether that would be a great idea for my mental health. But it is something that I constantly think about, that I consider. I might be open to doing like a short-term program. There are basically long-term and short-term homes. The one that I talked about at the beginning, where they gave me a boat and put me in sailing lessons and I was just there for the summer, that's a short-term home. And the whole deal with that is they'll keep you for a brief period of time while they're looking for a longer-term facility or home for you. And I think that that's something that I'd be willing to do and give people the same experience as I had, a positive experience that I had in that short-term home, because that can really be instrumental in somebody's life. Like all throughout foster care, I really held on to that memory, and it gave me a lot of motivation and inspired me to do well and to be financially stable in life so that I could afford some of the things that I was afforded in that home, and so that I could give back to people like myself who had like never had the opportunity to go boating, never had the opportunity to go swimming, be registered in all these different events. And I would love to do that for somebody else like they did that for me. That said as well, like foster care was actually a positive experience in some ways as well. One, I mentioned like going to church, that's been really instrumental in my life. And two, it taught me to work really hard and gave me a really good work ethic. I wanted to play sports growing up. I was always enrolled in hockey or lacrosse or soccer, sometimes judo, and it was really hard to stick with things because I was switching foster homes constantly. But one thing that I did always stick with was hockey, and a lot of the time Children's Aid Society would not pay for things, or they wouldn't pay for things on time. So I learned to just like go out and shovel driveways and charge $20 a driveway, and eventually after X amount of homes, I would have enough to pay for my hockey registration, or I'd have enough to pay for my equipment. And sometimes I got into camps where I was given free equipment and sometimes I didn't. So I learned to basically pay for things on my own at a really young age, which has been really helpful for me now. I've been self-employed a few times now, and each time I've done that, I've been fairly successful at running my business. And I think part of that, at least, is attributed to, or I can attribute to, growing up in foster care and having to work hard. Maybe it's not cool that I had to do that. I really don't know. There has to be this balance between like motivation to work hard and this discipline when you're younger, but also you're still a child and you want people to be children. It obviously depends on people's parenting styles and everything, but I think somewhere in the middle there is really great. And if I had to choose to do things again, I would probably choose like a little less independence as a child and maybe a little more love from where I was living. But I do think that it was helpful, and I am grateful overall for the experience. It was hard, it was difficult, and I don't want to do it again, but I am grateful for some of the things that it produced. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Please like and subscribe. There will be more stories for you if you liked this one. It's just going to get better and better, and I look forward to having different discussions. Feel free to comment below this video, and I will definitely reply to you, and we can have a good conversation about foster care. If you have any questions or if you want me to make a follow-up video where I talk about something more in depth, I'm happy to do that. Just let me know in the comments below. Take care.